All right, everybody. Welcome to our second of two lectures on Creole history. Um, this is part of an ongoing effort by the Friends of the Cabildo and the Creole Legacy Committee to encourage study of Creole history in New Orleans. So I hope last week you were able to watch Dion Butler's presentation, and we're going to move on into a little bit later time period, just in a few moments. I did want to mention if you are, this is something that's always free for members, but if you're not a member, you can become a member for as little as $50. And Museum Month is coming up in August. So when you get, when you renew your membership in the month of August, you can take a guest and you can go to over 25 museums here in the city of New Orleans, World War II Museum, NOMA, Ogden, as well as come see the new exhibits at the Louisiana State Museum. So it's really a great time to renew a membership, and you can take advantage of it. Nice, cool air conditioning, and see a bunch of museums and then have your Friends of the Cabildo membership as well, which will include tons of lectures throughout the fall, our symposium, and fundraising events like Go See Gallivant and Creole Christmas. So these are all and our concert series and film series. So I hope you take advantage of all those advantages or benefits you have with the Friends of the Cabildo. But tonight's lecture is going to be done by one of these Creole Heritage Committee members. He is a retired lawyer. He runs our school docent program. And if you ever see him on the sidelines at a Louisiana high school football game, do not yell at him. He's a very nice person. He's not rigging the game, but I want to welcome Harold Marchand, or as it says on there, Harold Marchand, referee, that proves that he is the referee as well. And we're going to be talking about Creole history during the Antebellum period. So, Harold, I want to thank you so much for being here tonight, and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to come listen to what I have to say this evening. I'm going to talk about a topic that you probably didn't hear about while you were in school, but it did exist. So I'm going to cover a lot of material, and I'm going to try to condense it to 45 minutes and leave time for any questions. I'm going to move on. All right. I'm presenting this on behalf of the Creole Legacy Committee from the Friends of the Cabildo. And my topic is Free People of Color in Antebellum, Louisiana. Now, the antebellum period began actually on April 30th, 1812, when Louisiana became a state. And it ended when Louisiana, as a state, ceded from the United States on January 26, 1861. And shortly thereafter joined the Confederacy on March 21st, 1861. This is my order of presentation. I'm going to define free people of color, how the population of free people of color developed, social environment, the legal environment, the golden age, decline, and conclusion. In other words, I'm going to tell you about the good, the bad, and the ugly, but this is all history. First of all, as far as the contributions of free people of color, they have been in the colony, initially a French colony, since its inception. But the contributions to the world were not widely acknowledged or published until the antebellum period of Louisiana. And you're going to hear that the population had grown a lot, because of events that happened away from Louisiana colony. All right, you're going to hear about a Haitian Revolution, and because of that, there was an increase in the population of free people of color. Now, free person of color. I remember when I was given a walking tour for the Friends of the Cabildo, I used the term free people of color. And the person who was critiquing me said, don't assume that everybody knows what you're talking about, free person of color. So I'm going to take this opportunity just to go to the definition, which is simple. It's a person of African descent who is not enslaved. That's a simple definition. And we can expand it a bit and say a person who is a mixture of African and European, which we had a lot of in the Louisiana colony, all right, and not enslaved, or a person with a mixture of Native American and African, or it can be a an African descent, a person of African descent who was born free. So that's my definition of free person of color. Now, who were the free people of color? Now, the first thing I want to mention is the Code Noir of 1724. I'm going to go back until the early colonial period. The Code Noir was a body of law that was used during the French colonial period to regulate slavery. All right. And in this particular code, there was reference to free people of color. And there's a reference to manumission. Now, what is manumission? I'll give you another definition as we proceed, but it's the act of a slave becoming freed by his owner, with the approval of the French Superior Council. That's the government that would approve a manumission. And as a result of this manumission, you become a free person of color. Then there were free Black immigrants that came from France, the Caribbean, and other locations who were never enslaved. And the manumitted offspring of Indians and later immigrants. Now, slaves, runaway slaves, sought safety in intermingling with the Native Americans. And any offspring who were eventually manumitted, they are considered to be part of the free people of color. And then there's the manumitted offspring of white slave masters and their slaves. Now, during this time, there was no interracial marriage. All right, the white slave owners, they would often take a female slave as a mistress. And he may manumit this person. And also the offspring, they take on the status of the mother. If the mother is a free person of color, then the children are also considered to be free. And also the Spanish colonial period, there's a body of law known as Las Siete Partidas. And you see the term coartación. That's another means of manumission during the Spanish colonial period. What that means is that the slave had the right to purchase his or her freedom. You can go to court and get a price set on what it costs for you to gain your freedom. And if you pay that price, then you are free. And most of all, there were refugees from the Haitian Revolution, both free people of color and enslaved. And we'll talk more about that as we go along, because as a result of the Haitian Revolution, the population of free people of color increased exponentially in the Louisiana colony. And then there were free people of color that were expelled from Cuba in 1809. They themselves were refugees from the Haitian Revolution and they settled in Cuba. And they were expelled from Cuba, and many of whom came to the Louisiana colony. On the other hand, there were occupations and professions that the free people of color were involved in during the Golden Age, we would talk more about later. Because Louisiana as a state had a very booming economy. We're talking about a port city of New Orleans, all right, where there was a lot of trade. And we're going to mention that free people of color had the right to own, inherit, and sell property, including slaves. They purchased plots of land alongside whites, and they were able to form and participate in social and cultural institutions such as opera and theaters. And they were involved in trades and specialized lines of work such as carpentry, stone cutting, etc. And there were professions that were involved in. There were professional managers, artists, clerks, scientists. And most of all, there were contributions to the arts. And many had success in business. And then we're going to talk about what caused this population of free people of color to decline. All right, we see that there was harsh legislation regarding African Americans, both slave and free. And this caused the free black population to shrink because of this harsh legislation. And all of this had predated the Civil War. Manumission, as I mentioned previously, was the act of freeing a slave by his or her owner. The French permitted it. It's also called enfranchisement, emancipation, freeing, or liberation. Now, during the Spanish colonial period, it was encouraged. As I mentioned previously, cotation allowed enslaved to purchase their freedom. Now, the Americans tolerated it, but eventually prohibited it. At one point, in order for, during the American period, to free a slave, the owner must show that the slave was over the age of 30 and engaged in 4 years of honest conduct, meaning no running away or no criminal conduct, which could be waived if the slave had saved the owner's life. Pardon me. Now, I'm going to mention the Haitian Revolution because this was one of the causes of the increase in the population of the free people of color. Haiti is formerly Saint-Domingue. It became Haiti after the slaves revolted and took over the island itself. It would become, as a war fought the freeing of the enslaved. They fought their freedom and they won, and it became the Republic of Haiti. And a lot of refugees came to the Louisiana colony. So this led to the increase in the free black population in Louisiana. And as I mentioned, there were refugees that were expelled from Cuba. All right, you refugee from the Haitian Revolution. All right, you settled in Cuba and you were expelled from Cuba. And many of those people arrived in New Orleans, further doubling the size of the city's population of free people of color. Now, these refugees included the French colonists, free people of color, and enslaved. Now, as I mentioned, this increased the free people of color population. 10% of the Louisiana population per the 1810 census was free. By 1840, there were 25,000 free people of color with an 80% literacy rate. And also, they owned 1/3 of the French Quarter and 70% of the Treme area in New Orleans. Another big event that happened is in 1811, the German Coast Slave Revolt. This is a revolt from slaves from the German coast, which covers St. Charles, St. John Parish. All right, it originated in La Place. You know, there were slaves that decided to flee the plantation, and the increase had gotten as far as about 200 to 500. However, this was not a successful revolt. At this point, I'm going to talk about what was the social environment during this time. The free people of color population was growing on its own. As I mentioned before, there was manumission. All right, and if you're free, then your children are also free. And the free people, free people of color population was augmented by the free people of color from Haiti. And there was a free black militia parading during the transfer ceremony pursuant to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Now, the white elite wanted restrictions on the free people of color population. The free people of color hoped to enjoy full rights and benefits of citizenships, you know, if they served in the militia. Now, what was happening during this time? There was a fear of slave rebellions because we have slave population, and right next to it, we had a free people of color population side by side. Because in the Haitian Revolution, you know, the free people of color aided the enslaved in gaining their freedom. All right, so people were aware of this incident, so it caused a little fear. And it was fear that the free people of color are potential accomplices to the slave revolt. And it heightened anxieties due to the influx of Black refugees from Haiti. Now, the first American governor was Governor Claiborne, and he was pressured by the Jefferson administration, meaning Thomas Jefferson, to reduce the free people of color who served in the militia. However, some wanted a reduction in the size of the free people of color population altogether. Now, at the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, at least 1 in 6 of roughly 8,000 people living in New Orleans was a free person of color. And between 1803, the date of the Louisiana Purchase, and 1860, the population of New Orleans grew rapidly from less than 10,000 in 1800 to over 150,000 in 1860. And this was due to immigration from different regions and for many different reasons. Now you see a picture of Claiborne and Jefferson. After the Louisiana Purchase, there was a need for clarification of laws which govern Louisiana. Let me just take it back a little bit. We became a Spanish colony in 1762, pardon me. All right. Initially, we were governed by French law. And then with the transfer to the Spanish colonial period, all right, there's a declaration that the Spanish law would govern the colony. And now this same colony is part of the United States. So there was an urgent need to clarify what are these laws that we're going to use to govern this addition to the United States. 1804, Congress divided the area in Louisiana Purchase to the territory of Orleans and the District of Louisiana. The president appointed a legislative council consisting of 13 members to govern this territory, the Louisiana Territory. And this council appointed 3 members as a committee to prepare a civil code and a criminal code. Now, bear in mind, Claiborne, he was not trained in civil law. He wanted the territory to be governed by the common law system. But in the meantime, he wants to know what is the current law we're going to use until such time as we've eventually become a common law territory. Now let's talk about the legal environment. Now the will of the legislature at the time was to keep all free people of color powerless as possible and to keep the enslaved enslaved. And the legislative themes at the time was the whites were legally superior. And I will show you this in the type of laws that were enacted. Keep the slaves powerless, treat the slaves as pieces of property, make emancipation difficult, prohibit free blacks from entering Louisiana, and expelling free blacks. Now you see examples of these laws that fit within these themes. The territorial legislation consisted of the Black Code of 1806. Now the Black Code, and I will get into it more, you know, it comes from the Code Noir with some changes that were more restrictive. The Digest of 1808, also known as the Civil Code of 1808, and also other race-based territorial statutes to govern the territory of Louisiana. The 1806 Black Code, it reenacted many provisions of the Code Noir that I made reference to that was introduced during the French colonial period that regulated slaves and punished slaves. And there are 2 names, James Brown and L. Moreau Leislet. They were charged with the the job to put together, all right, the law for Louisiana, the Civil Code, as well as the Black Code of 1806. Now, there were additional restrictions that were placed upon free people of color in the Black Code of 1806. And I mentioned as an example that free people of color should never insult or strike a white person, never presume to conceive themselves as equal to whites, yield to them in every occasion, and never speak or answer to them but with respect under penalty of imprisonment. All right. And this is when I mentioned earlier that part of the theme of the legislation was to consider whites to be legally superior. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. Now, I mentioned the Black Code of 1806, they abolished the Spanish cotación. As I mentioned previously, as a means of manumission where a slave can purchase his or her freedom. All right. So the Black Code eliminated that because they want to keep the slaves enslaved. That was part of the theme of the legislature. Now, the Black Code of 1806, even though it was meant to regulate slavery, it also referenced free people of color. Free people of color were allowed to carry weapons if they also carried a written certificate from the justice of the peace attesting to their freedom. You got to prove that you're not a slave and that you're free. Therefore, you have the right to carry firearms. And you may be in charge of a plantation. And you're entitled to trial by jury. However, you have to treat white people with respect. Now, there were restrictions on the free people of color that was mentioned in this Black Code of 1806. Free people of color could not vote. They could not serve on the jury. They could not hold political office. They could not marry a white person. And the crime of rape was defined only in relation to white women. The Civil Code of 1808. It was a legal foundation for the regulation of slaves and free people of color. It restated and reinforced the Black Code. Now, in this code itself, it mentions that slaves are property. Slaves had no rights. And it prohibited interracial marriage as far as free people of color. They could not marry a white person. The children of female slaves belonged to the mother slave master. And the emancipation of slaves was possible only as performing in accordance with the legislation on manumission. Now, the Civil Code of 1808 was finally approved, and it was based upon French law. Just a reminder, during the Spanish colonial period, there's a declaration that was Spanish law to govern the colony itself. Now we're part of the United States. Now, the digest, they mentioned digest, another name for the Civil Code of 1808. Claiborne just wanted to know what laws do we currently have. We're going to do status quo until we change it to be in accord with the other common law states. With regard to slave, it left in force the Black Code of 1806, adding the contractual incapacity of slaves. Slaves could not enter into contracts. It required that free people of color be identified in all legal documents as FMC, free man of color, FWC, free person of color. And it adopted a jury system and other common law procedures. Now, there was nothing in this digest that prohibited free people of color from owning property. So therefore, they were protected by the law of property and the Civil Code and also contract law. All right, they can sue to enforce a contract and they can own property. And there was very little gender or racial bias in the application. However, there was, the laws did reinforce white supremacy. So what's happening here is that free people of color had certain judicial rights. They were allowed to participate judicially because they had the right to enforce contracts, among other things. But the road to political participation was closed. As I mentioned previously, you can't vote, you can't hold office, you can't serve on the jury. Now, there were other legislative acts, and there may be some overlapping. I'm not going to be redundant. All right, just mention a couple of things. All right, every time these laws changed, they were more restrictive. They banned the immigration of free people of color. And I told you that in a legal environment, the white elite did not want to see too many free people of color. They wanted to get rid of as many as they could. And also, that's number 3, over the age of 15 and born elsewhere, you must leave. And look into number 5, freed slave. If you're freed, then the owner must post a bond of $1,000. The former slave master. What that does is to assure that you're free, but you got to leave. You got X number of days to leave the state itself, because the whole intent was to reduce the population of free people of color. Now, religious groups, and I'm talking about 1850, all right, they became banned, but prior to that, there were certain privileges that the free people of color enjoyed, but were later banned. And we'll talk about that. And emancipation by 1857 was completely eliminated. And I mentioned the German Coast slave revolt. It was unsuccessful. And as a result of this, and until the abolition of slavery, their separate legal status was made obsolete, meaning that you free people of person of color, all right, we're not going to look at your separate legal status as a free person of color, because we're imposing legislation to regulate you. They were required to carry passes and observe curfews. We're talking about the free people of color. Now, the Civil Code, all right, was revised in 1825, and the purpose was to eliminate the Spanish law, because the French law was going to predominate as an influence of the Louisiana Civil Code. It elevated French law as the main source of Louisiana jurisprudence. And it borrowed other laws from common law, but it was essentially a civil law jurisdiction. Now, I mentioned civil law and common law. Civil law, the judge rules by statutes. In other words, the law is stated by the legislature, so the judge rules on the interpretation of that written law. Common law is judge-made law. A dispute in common law jurisdiction is handled by whatever the custom is, and that's how the judge judges. Now, the regulations which reduce the population of the free people of color, for example, and I'm not going to mention everything because I mentioned it already about the curfew. They could not mask for balls. They could not place bets or wagers. They had to carry passes as a requirement to gain permission to travel outside the city. Prohibitions from gathering in public. They could at one time, but there were prohibitions. As more laws were made, they were more restrictive. Prohibition against testifying against whites. No emancipation of slaves. And crime to punish anything criticizing white supremacy. And we got to a point that they were not allowed to have organizations or societies. Now, there are certain privileges that free people of color had that, as I mentioned in the previous slide, that were further regulated with restrictive legislation. They were allowed to conduct and operate a business. They were allowed to invest and lend out money. And they were even allowed to purchase and own slaves. And they were allowed to attend social institutions such as church and theater. And they can live anywhere and build houses anywhere. And they were able to open schools to educate their children. They can conduct their own dances, balls, and social gatherings. They can create and enforce contracts and own property and weapons. These were privileges that were enjoyed, but again, I talk about how the free people of color population shrank. Every time a law was changed, it was more restrictive to prohibit these privileges that I just mentioned that they had at one time. And thus, you hear the term the golden years, just for the reasons I mentioned in the previous slide. I'm not going to repeat. These were the golden years where free people of color had certain freedoms, except for the political participation. And as free people of color, they were able to make many achievements being free, because as far as and I'll go over this, they were allowed to serve in the militia because they wanted to have certain freedom and privileges as a result, and rights of citizenship, which was a challenge. They were allowed to own property. They were allowed to practice the religion. All right. They were allowed social gatherings. All right. There were many literary works that were done by free people of color. They also engaged in philanthropy, health and human services, and they were involved in music, theater, and opera. And I'm going to talk about certain people that excelled in these particular areas. Now, granted, I can't tell you everything about free people of color in this one presentation, but I can give you the basics. And just to mention, some of the free people of color that made achievements, let's talk about Jordan Noble for one second. All right. He was born enslaved. He was eventually freed. He was a drummer during the Battle of New Orleans. Now, a drummer, during the battle was a person who transported signals, from the commanding officer to the troops. He was also involved in the Seminole War of 1836, the Mexican War of 1846, and during the Civil War. He helped form the militia companies for the Confederacy. However, during the Union occupation, he helped organize a free Black Native Guard. So he was enslaved, and he wasn't born here. He was born in Georgia, but he settled in New Orleans in 1811. All right, Major Joseph Savory. All right, he's from Haiti. He was in the French army during the Haitian Revolution. And what's his claim to fame is that he was the first Black second major in the U.S. Army. He was requested by Andrew Jackson, to fight the British in the Battle of New Orleans. And he was the combat commander. The nominal commander was Major Louis Quinn, a white person, but the combat commander was Captain Joseph Savory. And his militia was composed of former Haitian refugees. Vincent Populus, he was likely born a slave. He also excelled in the military. He became the first Black military officer, one of the first Black military officers. He served in the 1st Battalion of Fort Shares, Louisiana Militia, an organization of free Black soldiers. Legally, the militia had to be commanded by a white officer. But, Vincent Populus, he obtained a rank of military officer while serving in his militia. Now, as far as owning property, all right, We can go outside of Orleans Parish for the moment. Marie Simeon, all right, she was formerly enslaved, but in 1818 she owned a plantation. Now this is an example. She owned slaves and had 7,500 acres of land. This is in St. Landry Parish. Now the largest family of black planters and merchants that owned plantations was in Natchitoches Parish, and the black planters intermarried with each other. And this is the Montoya family. The family owned nearly 8% of slaves in Natchitoches Parish. And then in 1831, Louisiana sugar planter Andrew Durnford, he was the owner of the St. Rosalie plantation in Blackman's Parish. He owned 77 slaves and he owned land that's valued at over 3 million. Again, I got to give you all the history. You know, there were blacks that owned slaves, but understand that many of these slaves were relatives and friends, and they protected these slaves from being purchased by someone else. Now, as far as real estate, I'm going to mention Francois Lacroix. He was a cabinet maker. He had a tailoring shop. He was a free man of color. Etienne Cardelville, my French pronunciation is bad. They operated several businesses together, and they had careers in real estate. They invested in many numerous properties. And Lacroix, he donated some of his wealth to educational charities for other free people of color in New Orleans. Julian Hudson, all right, he was a professional portraitist. All right. He studied painting with the Italian miniaturist Antonio Mucci, and eventually he had his own studio on Bienville Street in New Orleans. A miniaturist was one that did miniature paintings, and his studio was in his mother's house on Bienville. Unfortunately, his career ended in 1844. He was in his early 30s, and he passed away. Norbert Rieu, or Norbert Rieu. He was a chemical engineer that revolutionized the sugar processing. And many of y'all know that the processing of sugar was very hazardous. It was done by slaves. It was wasteful. It was dangerous. So this chemical engineer, he found a multiple effect evaporator under vacuum. All right, that made for less waste of sugar. All right, it was less hazardous. So he revolutionized that industry. He was a free person of color. He was educated in France. Jules Leon, all right, he was a master lithographer. He executed a series of portraits in Louisiana that's still reprinted today. Now, he introduced the daguerreotype process in New Orleans, which is a forerunner of photography. Jean-Louis Dolio, he was a free man of color. He was known for his rendition of the Creole cottage. He employed traditionally Spanish architecture mixed with his unique spin on French, colonial building techniques, and he used local materials. Now you will see a couple of his cottages on Carter Street. All right. And he also was part of the militia. Now, in the picture that you see is one of his cottages at 933 St. Philip Street. Eugene and Daniel Wahlberg, they were enslaved. All right. They were sculptors and marble workers. And eventually they were freed by their father. To the right of the screen is a design of the floor of the St. Louis Cathedral that was done by Eugene Wahlberg. Now, what the brothers Eugene and Daniel also did was they created busts, statues, and tomb designs from their French Quarter studio. And this is a picture of the floor at St. Louis Cathedral that Eugene Wahlberg had designed. Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen in New Orleans. Now, she gave consultations in her home and held weekly ceremonies at her home on St. Anne Street, which was about a block away from Armstrong Park, which is formerly Congo Square. And she is credited with leading the St. John's Eve celebrations on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. Henriette DeLille, a free person of color. All right, she started the Sisters of the Holy Family. All right, now she was educated and she was educated to find a white suitor. Many of y'all might have heard of the Passage system, where her mother was part of the Passage system, where a white man would take on a mistress of African descent, all right, before getting married. And they would give him all the benefits of marriage, such as property, and they have children. And if they got married, then there's a myth that the placé, the woman would gain the property herself. Anyway, Henriette DeLille was raised for this system, and she did not want any part of it because of her Catholic education. So her mission was to educate the enslaved, take care of the poor, and also the elderly. Spiritualism. The Harmonic Circle was a group of Afro-Creole men who practiced spiritualism from 1858 until 1877. They fused religion with politics, and they encouraged Black rights and social equality. Now, they came from good families. They were educated. All right, they had economic stability, but they wanted to practice their religion. The Société d'Économie, again, excuse my French pronunciation. It was a mutual aid society, and it was a center of the social life for free people of color. They paid dues and they helped free people of color who were in need. And the Society of Artisans, they were Black veterans turned artisans. They were a literary society. They shared their work, protested injustice, and formulated resisting strategies, and became active members of change by assuming a broader quasi-political role with the free Francophone community of color. Now, in the 1840s, Ludger Bogiel, he operated a private school in 1840. He taught free children and the enslaved children. Teaching the enslaved was illegal at the time, but he overlooked that. The Lessonnels. This was an anthology of Black verse, a collection of original poems in French. All right, there were 84 works by 17 different writers, most of whom lived in New Orleans. Victor Séjour, he was part of the Society of Artisans. He wrote poems, short stories. He was also a playwright. He was a free person of color. However, he decided to go to France because of the racial climate in New Orleans, despite the fact he was a free person of color. Camille Theory, I'm sorry. He was a francophone poet. All right, he was a free person of color. He came from a family that had wealth, but there was still a lot of racism. So he relocated to France in order to practice his literary pursuits. Tommy LaFawn. Tommy LaFawn, all right, he was raised in poverty, but he acquired his education to become a school teacher. He was a merchant. He invested in real estate. He made loans to others, and he built his wealth from shrewd investments. And he had a frugal lifestyle. Now, he was a philanthropist. He made large contributions to several organizations, American anti-slavery organizations, the Underground Railroad, among other organizations. Marie Coupant, all right, she was born a slave and she became wealthy and free. And her mission was to educate orphans, black orphans. So she stipulated in her will that her property at 1941 Dauphine Street in the Faubourg Marigny area be used for the benefit of orphans in her neighborhood. So that was her legacy. Dr. Louis Charles Roudenaz, all right, he was a free man of color. He was raised in he was born in St. James Parish. He received his medical degree in Paris, and then he received a second medical degree at Dartmouth in the United States. And he established his medical practice in the French Quarter. He also had a newspaper called La Union. The Philharmonic Society. This was formed by free people of color, and it was integrated. This was the first non-theatrical orchestra in New Orleans. All right. There were about 100 musicians. They performed the works that they themselves created, and they also played the standard works of the day, even if they were not created by free people of color. Charles Lucian Lambert, he was a free person of color. He was a composer and a musician. Edmund Dede, or some people say Day, he was a Creole of color. And he was a child prodigy on the violin. Now, he had a composition that was the first piece of sheet music by a black person to be published in New Orleans. Now, he was fed up with how harshly he was treated in New Orleans, so he relocated to France, where he exercised his skill as a composer, conductor, and a performer. Basile Barré, all right, he was a composer. He had a copyright while he was enslaved of one of his works. It was published in 1860 when he was 16 years old. He worked in a music shop in the French Quarter, continuing employment under his former owners after he was emancipated. And he was also a street pianist, and he was a prolific composer of works for piano, especially in the idiom of parlor music in the late 19th century. Now, I mentioned certain accomplishments despite the harsh laws against free people of color. Some left for a better life. However, some stayed and made certain accomplishments. Now, where's the decline? The concern that free people of color would collaborate with abolitionists. That was their fear. Race-based distinction became more important than one's legal status. Again, every time a law was changed, it was more restrictive. Harsh legislation for the enslaved and free people of color. Then there were Irish and German immigrants that provided cheaper labor. Right, so they took over jobs that were formerly held by free people of color. So what happened to wealthy blacks? They sold their property because life was no longer pleasant. And the population shrank over the next 20 years. And many sought a better life in the North, in France, and in Haiti, and in Latin America. Now, let me conclude by saying that Louisiana had the largest free population of color in the South. And a lot of this was contributed to by manumission of free people of color. The influx of free people of color from Haiti enhanced the free people of color population. Now, what this caused was a lot of fear and anxiety, because you notice in some of the laws, what was the intent of the legislation? We want to limit the number of the free people of color, and we want to keep the enslaved enslaved. Because there was fear. You have slaves on one hand, and next to them, you got free people of color. Remember the Haitian Revolution, aided by free people of color. And there was a fear of that in Louisiana, that we would have another Haitian type revolution. There were revolts, but I talked about one that was unsuccessful. Many were unsuccessful. Discriminatory laws were made, and I gave you examples of that. And yes, there was a golden age where the free people of color who did not relocate decided to stay and stick it out, and they made accomplishment in several areas that we talked about. And with the continued passage of harsh legislation to control the people of color, that led to the shrinkage of the free people of color population. Okay, this is all I have, and I'm open to any questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful talk. Judy says, thank you for a very informative and enjoyable presentation. I did want to kick off the questions. If you do have questions and you want to ask them, please put them in the chat. You mentioned that Louisiana was the highest population with free persons of color. Did all in the South?
Mhm.
Did all the Southern states recognize free persons of color, or was it just a few, or how did that kind of work differently than Louisiana?
Okay, let me just mention, and I hope this is responsive to your question.
Mhm.
All right, I mentioned previously that there were means of gaining freedom, even from the French colonial period. There was manumission that was recognized, and the Spanish were considered to be very liberal. They encouraged manumission through the cotation. Now, if you were from, let's say, Louisiana purchased, it doubled the size of the United States. Outside of Louisiana territory, there was not manumission that existed as it did in the Louisiana territory. And this is why with the presence of the Spanish colonial period, it was encouraged because it would lead to less revolts if a person felt that they had a road to freedom. So this was mostly in the Louisiana territory, which currently carved out the 14 states. So within that territory, yes, there was a means of gaining freedom, as opposed to the Americans that came from the east and the north.
Yeah, that definitely does. Regine says, how public were the early private schools that free people of color organized? Were there also girls, women in these private schools?
I mentioned one example of a school by Ludger Bogill. I can't tell you, how much there were, how many schools there were, but at one point it was illegal to educate anyone who was enslaved. but there was schools, and I can't go into the extent as to how many and how public they were, but I know that at one point there was legislation, that established white public schools that did not include blacks. And then with the harsher legislation that came about over this period of time, I would say that these schools became less popular, but we got exceptions. We talked about Marie Couvent. She donated money to educate blacks. So they were mostly private schools, as we talked. So they were not public schools per se. So you had to educate your own people. The public schools are mostly for whites. And you can see during the history of New Orleans, one of our mayors established uh, free public education for whites only.
Um, if you were to leave Louisiana, what were your and you're a free person of color, what were your options to basically where you could go? So you mentioned a lot of people went to France, but were a lot of them um going up in the Northeast, going to like Boston and New York and places like that, and Philadelphia, or were there some that were moving to Tennessee or Kentucky or I guess or out west? I mean, was it? I mean, were those kind of your only options? I mean, there probably were there not a lot of people who were like, I'm leaving Louisiana and I'm going to Georgia.
Hmm. Okay, if you're free, you're not enslaved, then those were options. I mentioned the North, I mentioned Haiti, I mentioned going to France, I mentioned going to Latin America. And we talked about a couple of people that went to France. All right. Dee or Day Day went to France. All right. And a couple other people I mentioned. But uh, they went to places where, even though you weren't a slave, they wanted to go to a place where there wasn't as the racial tension that they experienced, despite the fact that they were free people of color. And this
Right.
is why they left in the first place. So you are free, you're not enslaved. So you had other options in other states, even though they were in the South, but you were escaping harsh legislation that's discriminated against you, despite the fact you were free.
All
I
right.
hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got one more question for you. Um, it was interesting to see the laws changing so quickly in the 1800s that made it much more difficult for people to become free person of color, to be, no longer slaves. But when it came to Haiti, did basically after a certain period of time, did we not see much immigration of people of color from Haiti, or did that continue to happen just because of the natural Louisiana French colonial aspect to the to I'm guessing if you were Haitian and it was after the revolution, France wasn't really a great option for you to go back to.
Right, right.
At the same time, the laws were constantly changing in Louisiana, where you got less and less, uh, you had less and less rights. So did people from free people, person of color from Haiti eventually stop coming to Louisiana for a period of time, or was it that they just that still people just kept coming no matter what because it was a better option than what they had?
All right, from what I've read so far, and I answer the question as best as I can, but as I mentioned previously, there were refugees, both white and free people of color, and slaves. They were escaping the revolution itself, and they came to another place where they spoke the same language. It was another French colony, and some, went to Cuba, and they were expelled from Cuba. So it was an option, and evidently it was an option for a lot since it more than doubled the population of the free people of color in Louisiana Territory.
Yeah, yeah. Um, all right, Harold, that was wait, let me get one more question here. Have you read Economy Hall, or do you have any other recommendations on books that would be enlightening in this subject?
I wish I could give a recommendation, but I, I can't at the moment.
Um, Well, fantastic, Harold. This was unbelievable. We've gotten 2 straight weeks of great history that's provided us a lot of context on Creole history in Louisiana. So, Harold, I want to thank you so much, and just mention we will be returning back with our first lecture for the fall. I know it's August is not the fall for everybody, but we're going to be returning to talk about Native Acapulco Indians of Mandeville of St. Tammany Parish, and Jackson Cantrell is going to be presenting on that. So that comes back on August 5th. So with that, I want to thank Harold one more time. I want to thank the Creole Heritage Committee, which has done unbelievable work, and I believe we'll probably be seeing some more presentations as we get into Beverly America 250 in 2026, because they played a very important role in our state's history. And so we look forward to more information and more work that you guys are doing. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight, and thank you so much, Harold. We appreciate it.
All right. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out to listen to me. And I
It
hope
was
you
just
got something
fantastic.
from it.
It was fantastic. Thanks so much, and thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.